Wealth and power usually silence the room, but arrogance is what truly demands attention. When a notorious tech magnate humiliated a struggling waitress in a dead language, he expected her to cower. Instead, she destroyed his ego with a single, flawless sentence. This is what happens when arrogance meets intellect. Madeleine wiped the condensation from the base of a heavy crystal water goblet, her movements mechanical but precise. The main dining room of L'Orangerie, Manhattan's most unapologetically exclusive restaurant, hummed with the low, calculated murmurs of the city's elite. Tonight was a Tuesday, which meant the room was entirely devoid of tourists, and filled exclusively with old money venture capitalists and those who wielded influence like a weapon. The air smelled of expensive Oud Cologne truffles and quiet desperation disguised as ambition. She adjusted her pristine white apron, her fingers lingering over the small silver name tag pinned to her chest. It felt like a brand. 3 years ago, Madeline Hayes had been a brilliant doctoral candidate at Columbia University, translating Cicero and arguing the complex nuances of Roman sociopolitics. Now she was carrying plates of seared foie gras to men who wouldn't even bother to look her in the eye. Her father's sudden illness, a brutal, fast-moving and aggressive form of early-onset Alzheimer's, had decimated their family finances. The specialized memory care facility cost more per month than most people made in a year. The academic scholarships had paused. The Ivy League dreams were indefinitely deferred, and Madeleine had quickly learned that academic pride didn't pay for essential prescription medication. She worked double shifts, smiling until her jaw ached, enduring the indignities of the service industry to keep her father safe. The maitre d', perpetually high-strung man named Harrison, swept past her, his face paler than usual. "Table 7, he hissed, grabbing Madeleine's forearm with surprising strength. "Cameron Ashford just walked in. He's in a foul mood tonight. You're on him. Do not make a single mistake, Madeleine. He got the last server fired for pouring from the wrong side." Madeleine nodded, feeling a familiar tightness bloom in her chest. Cameron Ashford was a fixture in the financial news cycle. The 32-year-old CEO of Aegis Tech had recently acquired a reputation for utter ruthlessness. He was famous for buying out smaller competitors, gutting their workforces, and bragging about his cold-blooded efficiency on popular business podcasts. He was known for his impeccably tailored Italian suits, his sharp jawline, and his profound contempt for anyone he deemed beneath his immense tax bracket. Approaching the corner booth, Madeleine carefully observed the dynamic. Ashford sat at the center, dominating the space, flanked by 2 people who looked equally formidable. To his left was Penelope Croft, a venture capitalist, known for her icy demeanor and the billions in assets she managed. To his right sat an older, distinguished European gentleman Madeleine recognized from a recent Forbes cover, Lorenzo Rossi, an Italian telecom magnate and philanthropist. "Good evening," Madeleine said, her voice smooth and perfectly modulated, adhering strictly to L'Orangerie's rigid training protocols. "Welcome to L'Orangerie. May I offer you sparkling or still water to begin your evening?" Cameron didn't even glance up from his smartphone. He flicked his finger across the screen. "Still, and not the domestic garbage. Aquapana, room temperature but slightly chilled. Figure it out." Madeleine didn't blink. "Of course, sir. And for your guests," Penelope offered a tight, polite smile, clearly accustomed to Cameron's abrasiveness. "Sparkling is fine for me, thank you." Lorenzo simply nodded in agreement, his sharp, dark eyes studying Cameron with a faint look of distaste. When Madeleine returned with the heavy silver tray bearing the waters and the leather-bound wine list, Cameron finally deigned to look at her. His eyes, a pale, calculating shade of blue, swept dismissively over her uniform, stopping at her name tag. "Madeleine," he drawled, drawing out the syllables as if tasting something deeply unpleasant. "Tell me, Madeleine, Do you actually know anything about the wine here, or do you just memorize the prices to sound important? The condescension was thick enough to choke on. Penelope shifted uncomfortably in her leather chair, while Lorenzo raised a silver eyebrow, silently watching the exchange unfold. "I am quite familiar with our cellar, Mr. Ashford," Madeline replied evenly, keeping her posture perfectly straight. "If you are considering a red to pair with our signature Wagyu beef, tonight the 2012 Chateau Haut-Brion offers excellent tannins without overpowering the delicate marbling of the meat." Cameron scoffed loudly, leaning back. "Haut-Brion, typical upsell for the uneducated. No, we're doing the 2009 Margot. And make sure the head sommelier decants it, not you. I don't need clumsy hands bruising a $5,000 bottle before the night has even started." "Very well," Madeline said, her face a mask of impenetrable professional serenity. She turned on her heel and walked away. Over the next hour, Cameron's behavior devolved from passively dismissive to actively hostile. He loudly complained about the ambient lighting being too harsh. He sent back his delicate scallop appetizer because the truffle shavings were insufficiently aromatic. Every single time Madeline approached the table, he used it as an opportunity to perform for his wealthy guests, treating her as a mindless prop in his one-man show of superiority. He was desperately trying to impress Lorenzo, Madeline realized, as she quietly poured more water. Cameron needed the Italian billionaire's crucial financial backing for an upcoming European expansion. However, Lorenzo seemed increasingly less impressed by Cameron's aggressive arrogance and far more focused on the quiet, dignified way the young waitress was handling the relentless verbal abuse. "You have to be aggressively dominant," Cameron was saying to Lorenzo, leaning heavily on the table and gesturing with his fork. "In the tech sector, you're either the predator or the prey. People like her." He blatantly flicked a finger toward Madeline as she cleared the empty appetizer plates. "They're prey. They lack the intellect, the ambition, the essential fire to conquer. They're perfectly content fetching things for their betters. It's evolutionary." Penelope frowned, setting her wine glass down. "Cameron, that's a bit harsh. She's just doing her job." "It's just reality, Penny," Cameron sneered, taking a long sip of the expensive Margot. "Nature demands a strict hierarchy. Some of us build the world, and some of us wipe the tables." Madeline's knuckles turned white as she stacked the heavy porcelain plates. She bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper. "Breathe," she told herself silently. "Dad's medical bills, the rent, the pharmacy. Just breathe." She carried the plates back to the kitchen, her hands shaking, not from fear, but from an overwhelming, suffocating surge of suppressed rage. The absolute breaking point occurred precisely during the main course. Madeline approached table 7, carrying a heavy, polished silver tray laden with their steaming entrees. As she leaned in carefully to set Penelope's plate down, Cameron abruptly threw his linen napkin onto the table to make a point, his elbow jutting out forcefully and clipping the very edge of Madeline's tray. A single tiny drop of dark au jus sauce sloshed over the rim of Lorenzo's pristine plate, landing dead center on the immaculate white tablecloth. "Unbelievable!" Cameron groaned, throwing his hands up in theatrical exasperation. "Are you entirely incompetent or just blind?" "I apologize, Mr. Ashford," Madeline said, quickly pulling a clean white cloth from her apron to professionally dab the spot. "You bumped my tray." "Excuse me." Cameron's voice rose sharply, slicing through the polite ambient noise of the dining room. Several nearby tables ceased their conversations and turned to look. Harrison the maître d' froze near the mahogany hostess stand, his eyes widening in sheer panic. "Did you just have the audacity to blame me for your profound clumsiness?" "Not at all, sir. I am simply stating what occurred." "I don't care what you're stating," Cameron interrupted, his handsome face flushing an ugly shade of crimson. He felt deeply embarrassed in front of Lorenzo, and like any cornered, egotistical predator, he viciously lashed out. He glared at Madeline, then turned to Lorenzo and Penelope with a theatrically weary sigh. This is exactly what happens when you are forced to hire from the absolute bottom of the barrel, Cameron loudly proclaimed. He looked back at Madeline, a cruel, mocking smile spreading across his face. He decided to put the final nail in the coffin, to humiliate her in a way she couldn't possibly comprehend, unequivocally proving his elite pedigree and Ivy League superiority. He leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms over his chest, and spoke loudly and deliberately. "Margaritas ante porcos," Cameron sneered, his tone dripping with venom. "Nihil obstat quo minus in opes stulti maniant." Pearls before swine. Nothing prevents the destitute from remaining fools. He chuckled darkly, looking at Lorenzo for validation. A little classical wisdom. Not that our dear, clumsy waitress understands a single syllable of it. She probably thinks I'm ordering off a secret menu. Penelope looked absolutely horrified, her mouth slightly agape. Lorenzo's expression darkened drastically, his jaw setting in rigid disapproval. Madeline stood perfectly still. The dining room around her seemed to momentarily fade away. The clinking of expensive silverware halted. The classical string music playing softly overhead faded to a dull, distant hum. In her mind, she wasn't wearing a stained apron anymore. She was back, standing in the grand lecture halls of Columbia University, fiercely debating the syntax of Seneca and the legendary arrogance of Roman patricians. Cameron Ashford had just made a fatal miscalculation. Out of all the ways he could have tried to demean her, he had chosen the one specific battlefield where he was hopelessly, entirely outmatched. Madeline slowly stood up straight. She didn't cower. She didn't apologize. Her posture dramatically shifted from a subservient, invisible server to a commanding academic presence. She looked down at Cameron, her gaze turning cold and sharp. When she spoke, her voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a razor-sharp, resonant clarity that carried to every corner of the suddenly dead quiet room. Her Latin pronunciation was absolutely flawless. Not the clunky, heavily anglicized ecclesiastical Latin of prep schools, but the precise, historically accurate, restored classical pronunciation. Equam memento rebus in arduis servare mentem domine, Madeline said softly, her dark eyes locking intensely onto his. Remember to keep a clear mind in difficult times, sir. Cameron's mocking smile instantly froze. The color drained from his face as his brain struggled to process what was happening. Madeline didn't stop. She took a deliberate step closer, leaning down, just slightly lowering her voice to a dangerous, deeply intimate register that brooked no argument. Sed qui asinum lavat sapone perdit, investimentis pretiosis, simia est semper simia. But he who washes an ass wastes his soap. In expensive clothes, a monkey is still a monkey. A sharp gasp echoed from across the table. Penelope had actually clapped a hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with absolute, unadulterated shock. But it was Lorenzo Rossi's reaction that shifted the entire atmosphere of the room. The older Italian billionaire suddenly burst into a booming, genuine laugh. He slapped the heavy oak table, making the crystal glassware rattle. "Brava!" Lorenzo shouted, his deep voice echoing in the stunned silence of l'orangerie. "Magnifico!" A breathtakingly perfect usage of Horace, and a truly brilliant, devastating adaptation of the medieval proverb. Cameron was visibly stuttering his mouth, opening and closing like a landed fish on a dock. How do you? My doctoral dissertation, right before I had to take a tragic leave of absence to care for my dying father, was entirely focused on the rhetorical strategies and linguistic superiority of the Roman elite, Madeline stated, switching seamlessly back to perfect English. She looked at Cameron with absolute, freezing pity. "And for your future reference, Mr. Ashford, your pronunciation of porcos was genuinely atrocious. You sounded less like a patrician and more like a barbarian desperately trying to buy a vowel." The entire dining room, which had been shamelessly eavesdropping on the escalating drama, let out a collective low murmur of absolute astonishment. An older gentleman at the adjacent table actually stifled a loud chuckle behind his linen napkin. Cameron's face turned a violent, explosive shade of purple. "Get the general manager," he spat, slamming his fist hard onto the table. "Get Harrison over here right this second. You're fired. You're absolutely done in this city." Harrison was already sprinting over, practically hyperventilating. "Mr. Ashford, I am so deeply, terribly sorry, I assure you. She will be terminated immediately." "Stop," Lorenzo Rossi commanded. He didn't raise his voice, but the sheer undeniable authority radiating from it froze the panicked manager right in his tracks. Lorenzo stood up, completely ignoring a fuming Cameron, and turned his full attention to Madeline. He smoothly pulled a sleek matte black business card from his tailored breast pocket and held it out to her. "Miss Hayes." Madeline said, her adrenaline finally starting to crash, her hands trembling ever so slightly as she reached out to accept the heavy card. Madeline Hayes. "Miss Hayes, my corporation is currently funding a massive private archaeological restoration project in the heart of Pompeii. We are in desperate need of a lead historical translator who intrinsically understands the deep nuance of the language, not just the basic vocabulary. Furthermore," Lorenzo cast a withering side-eye at Cameron, "I strongly prefer to surround myself with people who possess actual formidable intellect, rather than those who simply try to purchase the cheap appearance of it." Cameron shot up his chair, scraping loudly and aggressively against the hardwood floorboards. "Lorenzo, you can't be serious right now. We are in the middle of a major multi-million-dollar negotiation. You're going to let a glorified waitress—" "The negotiation is officially over, Cameron," Lorenzo interrupted smoothly, dropping several crisp $100 bills onto the table to cover the meal. "I strictly do not do business with small men who feel the need to crush those beneath them just to feel tall. It shows a fundamental, fatal weakness of character. A weakness that I absolutely assure you would have eventually bankrupted our partnership." Stunned silence continued to suffocate the luxurious dining room long after Lorenzo Rossi's imposing figure disappeared through the heavy mahogany doors of l'Orangerie. Cameron Ashford remained entirely frozen in his chair, his perfectly manicured hands gripping the crisp white tablecloth with enough force to turn his knuckles translucent. The sudden agonizing realization of his catastrophic miscalculation washed over him like a torrent of glacial water. He had not merely lost a multi-million-dollar international expansion deal, he had been publicly eviscerated, dismantled, and intellectually humiliated by a waitress he had deemed utterly subhuman. Penelope Croft, the ruthless venture capitalist who had silently witnessed the entire spectacular implosion, slowly picked up her designer clutch from the table. She looked at Cameron, not with anger, but with the cold, detached calculation of a predator evaluating a dying animal. "Penelope, wait!" Cameron stammered, his usually smooth, authoritative voice cracking under the immense weight of his panic. "Rossi is just throwing a tantrum. He's old money eccentric. I can fix this. I will call his management team in Milan tomorrow morning and smooth everything over." "You fundamentally misunderstand the situation, Cameron," Penelope replied, her tone practically dripping with absolute, freezing disdain. She stood up, smoothing the front of her tailored designer blazer. "Lorenzo Rossi does not throw tantrums. He makes definitive assessments of character. You just showed him that your judgment is fundamentally flawed, driven by fragile ego, rather than strategic intellect. If you are reckless enough to humiliate a stranger over a spilled drop of sauce, you are entirely too volatile to handle billions of dollars in international telecom assets. Cameron swallowed hard, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. My company is still vastly profitable, Penelope. Aegis Tech dominates the market. For now, Penelope corrected sharply, her eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. But my firm operates on foresight. As of this exact moment, I am officially withdrawing my firm's secondary funding for your upcoming series round. I strongly suggest you prepare your board of directors for a brutally turbulent fiscal quarter. Without another word, she turned her back on him and walked out of the restaurant, leaving Cameron completely alone in the center of the silent, staring dining room. Meanwhile, Madeline Hayes pushed through the swinging stainless steel doors into the chaotic heat of the restaurant kitchen, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She untied the stained white apron with trembling fingers, dropping the heavy cotton fabric onto the nearest preparation counter. Harrison, the perpetually anxious maître d', rushed through the doors seconds later, his face flushed with a mixture of sheer terror and bewildered awe. "Madeleine, what on earth just happened out there? Mr. Ashford is sitting at table 7, looking like he's about to have a coronary. Lorenzo Rossi paid the bill and vanished. And... Wait, are you actually leaving? I am resigning." "Harrison," Madeline stated clearly, her voice surprisingly steady now that the adrenaline was beginning to ebb, replaced by a profound, settling calm. "Effective immediately. Please mail my final paycheck to my apartment. I have a flight to Italy to catch." She walked out the back door into the cool, damp alleyway of the Manhattan evening, clutching Lorenzo Rossi's heavy, matte black business card in her palm, like a winning lottery ticket. For the first time in 3 agonizingly long, exhausted years, Madeline looked up at the suffocating city skyline and finally felt the crushing heavy chains of financial despair begin to break. 2 weeks later, the sweeping, sun-drenched hills of the Amalfi Coast replaced the claustrophobic concrete canyons of New York. True to his absolute word, Lorenzo Rossi had completely transformed Madeline's desperate reality overnight. Her father, William, had been safely transferred to an exclusive state-of-the-art neurological facility in Switzerland, fully funded by the Rossi Foundation's comprehensive employee medical trust. The crushing weight of the astronomical medical bills vanished, leaving Madeline entirely free to unleash her brilliant mind upon the task she had been genuinely born to do. Her new office was located in a restored 16th-century villa overlooking the sprawling, ancient excavation sites of Pompeii. The Rossi Foundation had recently unearthed a massive, heavily fortified subterranean vault belonging to a prominent Roman patrician containing hundreds of incredibly preserved, carbonized papyrus scrolls. Madeline was appointed as the Chief Director of Antiquities Translation, commanding a highly skilled team of international researchers. She thrived beautifully. Madeline's incredibly rare ability to decipher the complex, nuanced socio-political slang of the ancient Roman elite allowed her to decode texts that had utterly baffled prominent scholars for decades. She wasn't just translating words. She was aggressively reconstructing lost histories, mapping ancient trade routes, and uncovering corporate-style espionage from 2 millennia ago. Lorenzo Rossi, recognizing her unparalleled analytical genius, frequently invited her to his lavish estate in Milan, introducing her to his powerful circle of European aristocrats, international politicians, and global industry leaders. Madeline seamlessly transitioned from serving the elite to standing firmly among them, her fierce intellect commanding absolute, undeniable respect. Back in New York, however, the glamorous high-stakes world of Cameron Ashford was rapidly crumbling into a chaotic, fiery disaster. The immediate fallout from the disastrous dinner at l'Orangerie had been devastatingly swift. Word of Lorenzo Rossi's brutal rejection heavily circulated through the whispered, paranoid channels of Wall Street. Penelope Croft's massive withdrawal of capital triggered a terrifying domino effect. Within merely 3 months, Aegis Tech's notoriously inflated stock plummeted by a staggering 40%. Desperate, cornered and bleeding money, Cameron resorted to increasingly reckless, aggressive financial maneuvers. He desperately attempted to pivot Aegis Tech away from hardware and aggressively into the booming sector of historical artificial intelligence, seeking to acquire a groundbreaking European tech startup called Veritas Solutions. Veritas possessed a revolutionary proprietary algorithm capable of perfectly restoring and translating damaged historical artifacts. If Cameron could successfully acquire Veritas, he could instantly monopolize the highly lucrative academic tech sector, single-handedly saving his collapsing empire and his precious CEO title. The acquisition negotiations were scheduled to take place in Rome, marking Cameron's absolute final, desperate gamble to save his shattered reputation. He packed his bespoke Italian suits, boarded his rapidly depreciating private jet, and prepared to conquer the European market. He had absolutely no idea that he was walking blindly into a perfectly constructed, inescapable trap. The grand conference room of the Hotel de Russie in Rome was an absolute masterpiece of opulent, intimidating luxury, featuring sweeping classical frescoes, massive crystal chandeliers, and a heavily polished mahogany table that stretched for 20 feet. The oppressive summer heat of the Italian capital was kept comfortably at bay by aggressive air conditioning. Cameron Ashford sat nervously at the head of the long table, accompanied by his 2 visibly sweating corporate lawyers. His usually immaculate appearance was slightly ragged. The sharp lines of his face were deeply drawn with heavy exhaustion, and the arrogant, mocking spark that usually danced in his pale blue eyes had been entirely extinguished by months of relentless, crushing failure. He continuously checked his expensive platinum watch. The mysterious, shadowy executives representing the holding company that owned Veritas Solutions were already exactly 15 minutes late. This blatant disrespect infuriated Cameron, but he was entirely powerless to object. He desperately needed this acquisition to go through. Aegis Tech was mere weeks away from total insolvency. Finally, the heavy double doors of the grand conference room swung open. Lorenzo Rossi strode confidently into the room, impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, his silver hair catching the light of the chandeliers. Cameron's stomach instantly dropped into a terrifying, bottomless abyss. Lorenzo for. Cameron rasped, completely abandoning professional protocol as he desperately scrambled to his feet. What? What are you doing here? Are you representing the holding company? I do not merely represent the holding company, Cameron, Lorenzo replied smoothly, taking a seat directly opposite the trembling tech CEO. I am the majority owner of it. Veritas Solutions was entirely built using the extraordinary historical data decoded by my foundation's chief director. And naturally, I would never dream of selling such a precious, groundbreaking asset without my chief director's explicit, final approval. Lorenzo gestured gracefully toward the open doorway. Allow me to introduce the brilliant mastermind behind the Veritas algorithm and the absolute, final deciding vote on your company's pathetic attempt at a corporate buyout. Footsteps echoed sharply against the marble floor. Madeline Hayes walked slowly into the grand conference room. She was practically unrecognizable from the exhausted apron-clad waitress Cameron had brutally humiliated just 6 months prior. She wore a flawlessly tailored deep emerald green power suit, her posture radiating an absolute, crushing authority. She carried a thick leather portfolio, which she calmly placed onto the polished mahogany table with a heavy, definitive thud. Cameron physically recoiled, staggering backward until the edge of his chair caught the back of his knees, forcing him to abruptly sit down. The blood drained so rapidly from his face that he looked genuinely corpse-like. His lawyers glanced nervously between their terrified client and the imposing, beautiful woman standing at the end of the table. "Madeline," Cameron whispered horizontally, the name tearing out of his dry throat like broken glass. You are the director. Miss Hayes to you." Madeline corrected her voice, perfectly smooth, chillingly calm and entirely devoid of any mercy. She opened the leather portfolio, her dark eyes locking onto Cameron's terrified, pale blue gaze. "Let us skip the pleasantries, Mr. Ashford. We have extensively reviewed your aggressive acquisition proposal. We have also thoroughly reviewed the deeply tragic bleeding state of Aegis Tech's internal financials." She smoothly pulled a thick stack of aggressively red-lined financial documents from the portfolio and slid them deliberately across the vast expanse of the mahogany table. "Your company is absolutely hemorrhaging capital." Madeline stated her tone, possessing the precise clinical detachment of a surgeon examining a terminal patient. "Your board of directors is actively preparing a motion of no confidence. You do not actually have the liquid assets to purchase Veritas Solutions. You are desperately attempting to leverage your company's heavily inflated stock as collateral for a loan you cannot possibly repay." Cameron's lawyers rapidly leafed through the provided documents, their faces turning increasingly pale as they realized the opposing side had somehow acquired access to Aegis Tech's most highly classified, desperately hidden financial secrets. "How did you get these?" Cameron demanded, weakly, his voice trembling violently. "This is completely confidential corporate data. Actually, Penelope Croft legally provided them," Madeline replied, a small, terrifyingly sharp smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Penelope recently joined the Rossi Foundation's board of investment advisors. She firmly believes, as do we, that Aegis Tech is completely, utterly worthless under its current highly volatile leadership." Madeline leaned forward slightly, placing both hands flat upon the cool surface of the heavy table. The power dynamic in the room had completely irreversibly shifted. She was no longer the prey. She was the absolute, undeniable apex predator. "We are officially rejecting your pathetic acquisition offer, Mr. Ashford," Madeline pronounced cleanly. "However, the Rossi Holding Company is prepared to make a counteroffer. We will purchase Aegis Tech's outstanding corporate debt at 20 cents on the dollar. We will execute an aggressive, immediate, hostile takeover. We will completely dismantle your rapidly failing company, strip it for valuable patent parts, and forcibly remove you from the position of CEO by the end of the business day." Cameron gasped loudly, clutching his chest as if he had been physically shot. "You cannot do this. I built that company from the ground up. It is my entire life's work. You are deliberately destroying me over a spilled drop of sauce." "I am not destroying you over a spilled drop of sauce." "Cameron," Madeline replied, her voice dropping into a register of pure, unadulterated ice. "I am destroying you because you are a weak, incompetent businessman who recklessly alienated his only viable financial lifeline because he desperately needed to feel superior to a waitress. Your absolute hubris is the sole architect of your complete ruin." Tears of pure, humiliating defeat welled up in Cameron's eyes. He looked desperately at Lorenzo Rossi, practically begging for a shred of sympathy, but the Italian billionaire simply sat back in his chair, watching the corporate execution with a look of immense, satisfied approval. Cameron slowly lowered his head into his trembling hands, the crushing, inescapable reality of his absolute destruction finally breaking his spirit completely. He had lost everything: his wealth, his prestigious company, his inflated reputation, all entirely decimated by the very woman he had so arrogantly mocked. Madeline watched his complete, pathetic collapse without a single ounce of pity. She closed her leather portfolio with a sharp, definitive snap that echoed loudly through the silent, opulent room like the final strike of an executioner's heavy axe. She picked up her documents, turned gracefully on her heel, and prepared to leave the broken, ruined billionaire behind her forever. But before she walked out the grand mahogany doors, Madeline paused. She slowly looked back over her shoulder, her dark eyes blazing with the fierce, undeniable triumph of a true, conquering intellect. Soit semper tyrannis. Madeline softly whispered into the dead silence of the room, the beautiful, devastating Latin words serving as the absolute final nail in his corporate coffin. Thus always to tyrants. Vae victis, Mr. Ashford. Without waiting for a response, he was completely incapable of giving the former waitress, walked out into the brilliant golden light of Rome, leaving the shattered, sobbing billionaire entirely in the dark. Arrogance may win the moment, but true intellect always wins the war. Madeline's incredible journey from an exhausted, underestimated waitress to a powerful corporate conqueror proves that you should never judge a book by its cover or a server by their apron. Did Cameron get exactly what he deserved? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you loved this epic story of brilliant revenge, please hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more.